When a black businesswoman arrives at a prestigious luxury hotel for a well-deserved stay, she expects top-tier service and hospitality. What she doesn't expect is to be turned away at the front desk, met with a condescending smirk, thinly veiled prejudice, and a flimsy excuse. But she quickly realizes this isn't a mistake. It's intentional. With unwavering composure, she walks away, not in defeat, but with a plan, one that will change the hotel forever. Selena Vaughn stepped out of the sleek black car and onto the polished stone driveway of the Celestial Grand. The hotel was a beacon of exclusivity, a place where only the most affluent, the most connected, and the most powerful came to indulge in the height of luxury. Grand fountains cascaded in the center of the circular entrance, their soft, rhythmic splashes blending with the quiet hum of the city beyond. Towering palm trees lined the pristine walkways, their leaves rustling in the gentle evening breeze. Valet attendants, dressed immaculately in pressed navy uniforms, moved with quiet efficiency, greeting guests with a level of formality that bordered on reverence. Selena took it all in with a measured glance, her sharp eyes scanning the hotel's entrance with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped being dazzled by wealth. She had seen it all before. Opulence, exclusivity, spaces designed to remind people that power belonged to a select few. This was not new to her. Not after years of being one of the most influential businesswomen in the world. Not after building Vaughn Enterprises from the ground up, turning a modest investment firm into an empire that stretched across real estate, hospitality, and global markets. Luxury was no longer a novelty, it was simply the standard she had come to expect. But she could still appreciate the aesthetics, the attention to detail, the deliberate curation of an atmosphere meant to exude perfection. The long flight had been exhausting, and for once, Selena had opted for comfort over her usual tailored business attire. She was dressed casually, dark jeans, a fitted cashmere sweater, and her favorite pair of designer flats. Her coiled, natural hair was pulled into a loose updo, framing a face that radiated quiet authority. She hadn't felt the need to dress to impress tonight. She was here for rest, a brief respite before an important investment summit the next day. Still, despite her relaxed appearance, there was an undeniable presence about her, something in the way she carried herself, in the quiet confidence of her movements, that demanded attention. As she stepped inside the Celestial Grand, she was immediately greeted by the cool blast of air conditioning and the hushed murmur of refined conversation. The hotel's lobby was a masterpiece of understated elegance, vaulted ceilings stretching high above, chandeliers casting a warm golden glow, plush velvet seating arranged in intimate clusters. The scent of fresh-cut orchids mingled with the faint aroma of gourmet espresso from the in-house cafe, creating an atmosphere of both indulgence and restraint. Every detail was meticulously designed to remind its guests that they were among the elite. Selena walked toward the front desk, where a young man in a perfectly tailored suit stood behind the sleek marble counter. His name tag read Brian Lewis, and he was typing away at the computer, his expression one of deep concentration, though Selena could tell from experience that it was more for show than necessity. He barely spared her a glance when she stopped in front of him. "Good evening," Selena said smoothly, her tone polite but firm. "I have a reservation under the name Selena Vaughn." Brian's fingers paused momentarily over the keyboard before he finally looked up, his gaze flickering over her with the briefest moment of assessment. It was subtle, so subtle that someone less perceptive might have missed it, but Selena had spent a lifetime reading these kinds of micro-expressions. The way his eyes skimmed over her casual attire, the slight stiffening of his posture, the forced neutrality in his expression, it was all there. A flicker of something just beneath the surface, something she had seen more times than she could count. Assumptions. She wasn't wearing an expensive evening gown. She wasn't adorned with obvious designer logos or dripping in jewelry. She wasn't the kind of guest he expected, at least, not the kind he was accustomed to treating with deference. Brian's practiced, professional smile was polite but hollow. "Let me check for you," he said, his voice carrying the kind of slow, deliberate cadence that immediately set off warning bells in Selena's mind. He turned back to the computer, his fingers moving across the keys, but too slowly, as if he were intentionally drawing out the process. Selena watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She had encountered this before, many times in fact. The look of someone deciding who she was before she had even spoken. The look of someone making assumptions based on her appearance, based on nothing more than the fact that she didn't fit into the narrow mold they had constructed in their mind. After what felt like an unnecessarily long pause, Brian glanced back up at her, his polite smile tightening at the edges. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see any reservation under that name." Selina's brows furrowed slightly, though her composure remained intact. "That can't be right. My assistant booked this over a month ago. Can you check again?" Brian gave a theatrical sigh, as if she were inconveniencing him, and made a show of typing a few more keys. But Selina could tell he wasn't really looking. His eyes were unfocused, his movements deliberately slow. After another pause, he shook his head. "Nope. Sorry. Nothing under that name." Selina inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain calm. This was not new. This was not surprising. But that didn't mean it wasn't infuriating. "Try checking under the name of my assistant, Rachel Montgomery." Brian barely concealed his annoyance as he repeated the same slow, exaggerated process. After another drawn-out moment, he looked back up at her. "No, ma'am. No reservation under that name either." Selina studied him for a long moment. She could have pulled out her phone, shown him the confirmation email, forced him to acknowledge the error. But she already knew this wasn't about a mistake. This was something else. Something uglier. "Is there a manager I could speak with?" she asked, her voice still even, but with an edge of quiet authority. Brian raised an eyebrow, his smile almost patronizing now. "I'm sure they'll tell you the same thing, ma'am. But if you'd like to wait, I can see if someone is available." Selina gave a slow nod, her patience wearing thin. "Thank you." Brian picked up the phone, and Selina could hear the shift in his tone as he spoke to someone on the other end. The subtle dismissiveness, the lack of urgency. A guest is asking for a manager, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested she was a nuisance rather than a valued customer. He set the phone down and flashed her another hollow smile. "Someone will be with you shortly." Selina turned away from the counter, walking over to one of the plush couches in the lobby. She sat down, crossing her legs, her back straight. She could feel the eyes of other guests on her, some curious, some indifferent. It wasn't the first time she had been in a space like this, a space that exuded wealth and exclusivity, a space where people like her were often subtly, quietly reminded that they weren't expected to belong. As she sat there, waiting, she let her mind drift, back to where she had come from, back to the long nights her mother had spent working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, back to the countless times she had been underestimated, dismissed, overlooked. And yet, here she was. A self-made billionaire. A woman who had shattered every ceiling placed above her. Her phone buzzed in her bag, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel, checking in to make sure everything was going smoothly. Selina glanced back at the front desk, where Brian was now idly tapping on the keyboard, looking bored. No, she thought. Everything was not going smoothly. And she wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Selina sat back against the plush velvet of the lobby couch, her hands resting loosely in her lap, but her mind was anything but relaxed. Her patience was not infinite, and she had already spent enough time waiting for people like Brian, people who thought they could decide who belonged in spaces like this. She glanced at her phone again, considering whether to call Rachel and have her send over the reservation confirmation. But something in her gut told her this wasn't just an administrative error. This was deliberate. This was about perception, about power, about the quiet, insidious ways people like her were dismissed. She didn't need proof. She needed action. A few minutes passed before she heard the sharp click of heels against the marble floor. A woman approached, her posture rigid, her expression professionally neutral, but tinged with the kind of impatience that suggested she had already decided this conversation was a waste of her time. Her name tag read Catherine Miller, hotel manager. Blonde, mid-40s, dressed in a pristine white blouse and a navy pencil skirt, her hair tucked into a neat chignon. She exuded efficiency, control, and the unmistakable air of someone who believed she was in charge of every room she walked into. Selina stood as Catherine reached her, extending a hand. Catherine hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before taking it. The grip was firm but perfunctory, the kind of handshake offered out of obligation rather than respect. "Miss Vaughn," Catherine said, her tone clipped, her smile tight. I understand there's been an issue with your reservation. Selina held her gaze, watching for the subtle tells. Catherine already knew. She had known before she walked over here. This wasn't her first time handling a situation like this, but she had expected it to be someone else. Someone who would accept her practiced, corporate apology and quietly leave. There hasn't been an issue with my reservation, Selina corrected smoothly. There's been an issue with how it's being handled. Catherine blinked once, her expression unreadable. I've spoken with the front desk, and I'm afraid we don't have any record of a booking under your name, or under the name of your assistant. And unfortunately, we're currently at full capacity. Selina's jaw tightened slightly. She had anticipated this. It was always the same script, the same excuses, the same careful avoidance of direct discrimination. You're fully booked, she repeated, her voice even. Yes. That's interesting, Selina said, tilting her head slightly, because I happened to check your website before I arrived, and it showed availability for your penthouse suite, as well as multiple executive rooms. A flicker. Just a flicker of something in Catherine's eyes before she recovered. Our system updates in real time. It's possible those rooms were booked just before you arrived. Selina let a slow breath out through her nose. And yet, you didn't check. Catherine's smile was polite, but there was something condescending beneath it, something patronizingly firm. I assure you, Miss Vaughn, if we had availability, we would be happy to accommodate you. But unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. Selina studied her for a long moment, weighing her options. She could push. She could demand to see the reservation logs, could call Rachel and have her send the confirmation right now, force them into an uncomfortable admission of their mistake. But she had played that game before, and it had never been about proving them wrong. No, she thought, not this time. Selina smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made Catherine's posture shift ever so slightly, as if sensing something she didn't quite understand. That's a shame, Selina said, her voice carrying an edge of something unreadable. I was looking forward to my stay. Catherine gave a practiced, sympathetic nod. I apologize for the inconvenience. Selina just kept smiling. Oh, no need to apologize, she said lightly. I'll find somewhere else. And with that she turned on her heel, her exit as controlled and graceful as every move she made. But the moment she stepped outside, the warm night air brushing against her skin, she pulled out her phone and dialed Rachel's number. Selina, Rachel's voice came through immediately. Everything okay? Selina slid into the back seat of her waiting car, her voice calm but laced with something sharp beneath the surface. No, she said. It's not. Rachel was silent for half a second, and then her tone shifted. All business. What do you need? Find out everything you can about Celestial Grand, Selina said, her fingers drumming lightly against the leather armrest. Ownership, financials, assets, liabilities. If there's a weakness, I want to know it. Rachel didn't hesitate. Understood. I'll get back to you within the hour. Selina ended the call and looked out the tinted window as the car pulled away from the glowing facade of the Celestial Grand. They thought they had denied her a room. They had no idea what they had just given her instead. A mission, a target. And very soon, a new property to add to her empire. Selina sat in the back of her car, her fingers tracing absent patterns against the cool leather of the seat as the city lights blurred past the window. The distant hum of traffic filled the silence, but her mind was focused, sharp, already moving 3 steps ahead. She had spent years perfecting this kind of control, the ability to push aside emotion in favor of strategy, to turn insult into opportunity. This was no different. Her phone buzzed against her palm, and she glanced down at the screen. Rachel Montgomery, right on time. She answered with a simple, talk to me. Rachel didn't waste breath on pleasantries. I've pulled the initial financial reports on Celestial Grand and Sterling Hospitality Group. You were right. It's a mess. Selina's lips curled slightly. Go on. Sterling Hospitality has been struggling for the last 2 years, Rachel continued, her voice brisk and efficient. They expanded too aggressively, acquired a few underperforming properties, and now they're hemorrhaging cash. Celestial Grand is one of their flagship locations, but occupancy rates have been steadily declining. Poor management, bad customer service, plenty of online complaints about discriminatory practices, which isn't exactly great for their brand image. Selina tilted her head slightly, considering. How bad is it? Bad, Rachel confirmed. From what I can see, their quarterly earnings are down nearly 20% year over year. They've been offloading assets quietly, probably to stay afloat. If we move fast, we could take Celestial Grand off their hands before they realize just how much leverage we have. Selina tapped her nails against the screen of her phone, thinking. She had expected the hotel to have some operational issues. Poor management was obvious from the moment she had walked in. But this level of vulnerability was better than she could have hoped for. They weren't just in trouble. They were desperate. Who do I need to talk to? She asked. Sterling CEO Richard Sterling. He's old money, inherited the company from his father, but he's not the visionary type. More concerned with maintaining appearances than making smart business moves. If we pressure him the right way, he'll fold. Selina smirked slightly. And by the right way? We make them think they're getting a lifeline, Rachel said simply. An easy exit before their shareholders start asking questions they can't answer. Selina leaned back, letting the weight of the information settle. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was a perfect business opportunity. A chance to acquire a valuable asset at a fraction of its worth. To take something broken and turn it into something profitable. More than that, it was about power, control. A reminder to people like Brian Lewis and Catherine Miller that they didn't get to decide who belonged. She made her decision. Set up a meeting, she said. I want it on the books within 24 hours. Rachel didn't hesitate. Consider it done. Selina ended the call and stared out at the city skyline, the towering glass buildings reflecting the golden glow of streetlights. This was what she did best. She didn't fight battles in the moment. She fought them in the boardroom, in contracts and acquisitions, in the quiet, ruthless way that left no room for argument. Catherine and Brian had made a mistake. Now they were about to find out exactly what that mistake would cost them. The next morning, Selina Vaughn woke early. The city still wrapped in the soft hush of dawn as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse. The skyline stretched out before her, a gleaming testament to power and ambition, and yet her mind was already elsewhere, fixed on the first move in what would be a carefully orchestrated game. She wasn't just here to buy a hotel. She was here to take something that had once tried to reject her and reshape it in her own image. By the time she sat down at the long glass conference table in her home office, her team was already assembled on a video call. The crisp, professional faces of her inner circle filled the screen. Anthony Delgado, her lead attorney, sharp-eyed and analytical as always. Rachel Montgomery, her assistant and right hand, a model of cool efficiency. And Gregory Shaw, her financial strategist, flipping through documents on his tablet, already running numbers. All right, Selina said, her voice smooth but carrying that quiet edge of command that made people sit up straighter when she spoke. Where are we? Rachel took the lead. The meeting with Sterling is set for this afternoon. It'll be private, no media, no outside investors, just you, him, and his CFO, Elliot Garner. From what I gathered, they think you're coming in as a potential investor, not an outright buyer. That's how they framed it. Selina arched a brow slightly. Interesting. They don't want to admit how much trouble they're in. Not publicly, no, Anthony interjected. But the numbers don't lie. I had my team go deeper into Sterling Hospitality's financials. They've been in quiet talks with multiple firms about liquidating certain properties, but nothing's moved forward. That tells me they're either asking too much, or they're hesitant to let go of a major asset like Celestial Grand. If they're still entertaining outside funding, that means they don't want to sell, at least not yet. Selina leaned back, thoughtful. Then we make them want to sell. Gregory nodded, pushing up his glasses. We already have the leverage. Their debt load is climbing, their investors are nervous, and if we apply the right amount of pressure, we can make this an easy decision for them. The key is making sure they think it was their idea. Selina smirked. Exactly. She had no intention of dragging out a long negotiation. She wanted the deal closed fast, before Sterling had time to shop it around or let pride get in the way. There was always a balance in acquisitions like these, too aggressive, and they'd push back on principle, too passive, and they'd think they had the upper hand. She needed them to believe they were salvaging their own company, that selling to her was not just their best option, but their only option. Rachel glanced at her tablet. If you're looking for an angle, their latest quarterly report was just released this morning. Earnings are worse than analysts predicted. Their stock took a hit right at market open. Selina exhaled a quiet breath. That was the opportunity she needed. Good. That gives us an opening. When we sit down, I want Sterling to feel the weight of this moment. I want him to know that his back is against the wall before we even make an offer. Do you want me to leak anything to the press? Rachel asked. A little well-placed speculation could nudge them in the right direction. Selina considered it, then shook her head. Not yet. If we go public too soon, they'll get defensive. Let's see how they respond today. If they hesitate, we apply external pressure. Anthony smiled slightly, tapping his pen against his legal pad. I like it. Let them feel trapped without ever realizing who's tightening the walls. Selina glanced at the time. All right. Let's get this done. A few hours later, she arrived at the Sterling Hospitality headquarters, a sleek glass building in Midtown Manhattan that was trying a little too hard to project an image of stability. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. She felt the way the receptionist straightened at her presence, the way employees subtly glanced in her direction as she moved through the polished lobby. She was a known name in the industry. When Selina Vaughn walked into a boardroom, it usually meant something was about to change. A young assistant escorted her to the conference room, where Richard Sterling and Elliot Garner were already waiting. Sterling was in his early 60s, silver-haired and tanned, the kind of old-money executive who had never had to fight for a seat at the table. Garner, his CFO, was younger, sharp-eyed, and carrying the kind of stress that came from being the one responsible for putting out financial fires. Miss Vaughn, Sterling greeted smoothly, standing as she entered. A pleasure to meet you. Selina gave a polite nod, shaking his hand before taking a seat across from him. Likewise. I appreciate you taking the time. Sterling smiled, all corporate charm. When Rachel reached out, I was intrigued. I understand you're interested in exploring investment opportunities. Selina let the question hang for a beat, just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then, she smiled slightly. I'm interested in opportunities, yes. And I think we both know your company is in need of one. Sterling's smile tightened just slightly. We're in a period of strategic restructuring, that's all. The market has been difficult, but we're positioned for long-term success. Selina tilted her head. That's an interesting way to frame a 20% revenue decline. Garner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Vaughn, let's be clear, Sterling Hospitality is not in the business of selling off prime assets. Celestial Grand is one of our flagship properties, and while we've had some challenges, we're confident we can turn things around. Selina exhaled slowly, as if she were contemplating something. Then, she reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the table. This is a breakdown of your last 3 quarters. Projections show your cash reserves are dwindling. Your debt-to-equity ratio is rising, and investor confidence is slipping. If you truly believed you could turn things around, you wouldn't have had backdoor meetings with 3 different private equity firms in the last 2 months. Sterling's jaw tightened, but Garner looked genuinely startled. How did you? Selina smiled. I do my homework. Silence stretched between them. You don't want to sell, Selina continued, but you will. Because your options are running out, and the longer you wait, the worse your leverage gets. I'm offering you a way out before that happens. Sterling leaned back in his chair, studying her. And what exactly are you offering? Selina folded her hands neatly on the table. A direct butte. Full cash offer. No contingencies. We close in under 30 days. Garner blinked. That's an aggressive timeline. It is, Selina agreed. But it's also a guarantee. No waiting. No drawn-out negotiations, no risk of another quarter disappointing your shareholders. Sterling looked at her for a long moment. You want this hotel that badly? Selina's smile was unreadable. I want what's valuable. Right now you don't see it that way, but give it a little more time, and you will. She let her words settle, watching the way Sterling's fingers tapped lightly against the table, the way Garner glanced at him, waiting for his response. They weren't ready to admit it yet, but they would be soon. And when they did, she would be waiting. The air in the conference room was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of reality pressing against Richard Sterling's carefully constructed facade. Selina Vaughn had just handed him the truth in cold, irrefutable numbers, and now all that remained was whether he would acknowledge it or let his pride drag him further into the pit he had been desperately trying to climb out of. His fingers drummed lightly against the mahogany table, his expression a careful mask of contemplation, but Selina could see it, the slight tightness around his mouth, the subtle shift in his posture. He was cornered, and he knew it. Elliot Garner, the CFO, was the first to break the silence. "Miss Vaughn," he said, clearing his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "A 30-day close is highly ambitious. We would need time for due diligence, for regulatory approvals, for—" "I don't need time," Selina interrupted smoothly, her voice calm but firm. "I've already done my due diligence. My team has reviewed your financials, assessed the liabilities, and mapped out the necessary transition plans. The offer is structured to move quickly, because that's what benefits you most." Sterling exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering toward Garner before returning to her. "I appreciate your confidence, Miss Vaughn, but you must understand, Celestial Grand is a legacy property. It's been in our portfolio for decades. I can't just—" "You can," Selina cut in, her tone sharper now, deliberate. "And you will. Because legacy doesn't pay off debt. Sentiment doesn't stop your stock from tanking. And stubbornness doesn't keep investors from pulling out when they realize you're holding on to a property that is bleeding cash faster than you can patch the holes." Sterling's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She had him. "You don't have another investor lined up," she continued, watching the way his fingers stilled, the way Garner subtly shifted in his seat. "Because if you did, this meeting wouldn't be happening. And if you had a way to save this hotel, you wouldn't be entertaining my offer. But here we are." She let the words settle, the silence stretching just long enough to make the impact clear. "I'm not here to negotiate against myself," she said finally, leaning back in her chair, exuding the kind of effortless control that made it impossible to ignore her. "This is a clean deal. No contingencies, no drawn-out approvals. You sign, and in 30 days this problem disappears from your books. The only question is whether you want to make that decision now, while you still have some control, or later when you don't." Sterling's fingers twitched slightly against the table, his mind clearly racing through the implications. He wanted to fight, to argue, to push back just for the sake of salvaging his ego, but he couldn't. Not against this. Garner cleared his throat again, shifting uncomfortably. "If we were to consider this offer, we would need to review the terms in detail." "Of course," Selina said easily, as if she hadn't just dismantled them piece by piece. "I'll have my attorney send over the documents by the end of the day. But let's not pretend this is an if. It's a matter of when." Sterling's gaze hardened, but there was something else there now. Resignation. He had lost this battle before he even walked into the room. He just hadn't realized it yet. Finally, he exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Fine. Send the paperwork. We'll review it." Selina smiled slightly, knowing full well that reviewing was nothing more than a formality at this point. The decision had already been made. "Pleasure doing business with you," she said, standing smoothly, extending a hand. Sterling hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, his grip firm but lacking the confidence it had held when she first walked in. As she stepped out of the conference room, Rachel was already waiting in the hallway, phone in hand. She raised an eyebrow at Selina's expression. "They caved," Selina said simply. Rachel smirked, already opening a file on her tablet. "Told you they would." "Get the legal team moving," Selina instructed as they walked toward the elevator. "I want contracts in their inbox within the hour. We're closing this fast." Rachel nodded, already typing out instructions. "And when we do?" Selina stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind her, her reflection staring back at her in the sleek mirrored walls. "Then," she said, her voice smooth, steady, carrying the quiet weight of absolute certainty, "we walk through those doors again, but this time as the owners." 30 days later, the ink was dry. The contracts were signed, the funds had transferred, and the Celestial Grand no longer belonged to Sterling Hospitality. It was hers. Selina Vaughn had built an empire by knowing exactly when to strike, by recognizing the moment when power was shifting and stepping in to take control before anyone else even realized the balance had tipped. And now, as her car pulled up in front of the gleaming facade of the Celestial Grand, she felt the full weight of that power settling into place. The entrance looked the same as the night she had been turned away. Grand fountains still cascading, the towering palm trees still lining the walkways, the valet attendants still moving with rehearsed precision. But something had changed. The energy was different. Because now, she was the one they worked for. As the driver opened her door, she stepped out with measured grace, dressed in a tailored black suit that skimmed her figure perfectly, the silk blouse beneath it crisp and flawless. She had chosen the outfit deliberately, elegant, powerful, commanding. She wasn't here as a guest. She was here as the woman who owned everything these people thought they had control over. Rachel was already waiting at the entrance, a tablet in hand, her expression sharp and knowing. "Welcome to your hotel," she murmured as Selina reached her. Selina let a slow, deliberate smile curve her lips. "Let's get to work." She walked through the glass doors, stepping into the same lobby where she had once been dismissed, where Brian Lewis had barely looked up from his computer before deciding she didn't belong. Now the same space felt different, the hushed conversations faltering as people recognized her. Staff glanced up, eyes widening slightly, nervous energy crackling beneath the surface. The guests didn't know her, not yet, but the employees did. The rumors had already spread. The new owner had arrived. Her heels clicked against the marble as she moved toward the front desk where Brian stood, pale and visibly stiff, the realization of who she was fully dawning on him. The smug condescension he had once wielded so effortlessly was gone, replaced by a kind of nervous rigidity that almost made her laugh. He swallowed hard, his hands twitching slightly as he adjusted the lapels of his jacket. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice not quite steady. Selina stopped directly in front of the desk, tilting her head slightly. "Ah," she said lightly. "So now I get a proper greeting." Brian blanched. I. She held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it. I have no interest in whatever excuse you've prepared." His mouth snapped shut. Rachel stepped forward smoothly, flipping open a file. Brian Lewis, front desk supervisor for the last 4 years. Multiple complaints from guests about unprofessional behavior, poor service ratings, and a distinct pattern of bias in customer interactions. Brian's face drained of color. Selina tapped a manicured nail against the counter. "That's quite a track record. And yet, you still felt comfortable treating guests however you pleased." I didn't know who you were," he stammered. Selina's eyes sharpened. "That's the problem, Brian. It shouldn't have mattered." He swallowed, his gaze darting toward Catherine Miller, who had just stepped out of her office, her usual composed expression replaced with something closer to dread. Selina turned her attention to the woman who had so confidently dismissed her the last time she was here. "Catherine," she greeted, her voice smooth, deadly. "I assume you've heard the news." The older woman hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, Miss Vaughn. Congratulations on your acquisition." Selina's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How generous of you." She turned slightly, scanning the lobby. "When I was here last, you told me there was nothing you could do, that you were fully booked, that there were policies in place, that there was no mistake to correct." Catherine's jaw tensed. "I'd love to know," Selina continued, her voice carrying just enough volume to make sure the surrounding staff could hear. "If that's the level of service you provide to all guests, or just the ones you assume don't belong." Catherine opened her mouth but hesitated. She knew there was no good answer to that. Selina exhaled, as if she had already grown tired of the conversation. "You'll find that I have no patience for incompetence," she said, tone flat. "You were responsible for ensuring that every guest who walked through these doors was treated with respect, and you failed, repeatedly." Catherine straightened, her professionalism snapping back into place. "I understand, Miss Vaughn, if you're asking for my resignation." Selina raised a brow. "I'm not asking." A flicker of something, defeat, maybe, flashed across Catherine's face before she gave a small, stiff nod. "Understood." She turned on her heel and walked toward her office, shoulders squared, her exit silent but final. Selina glanced back at Brian. You, on the other hand, she said, watching him flinch slightly, are fired. His mouth opened and closed uselessly, but no words came out. Rachel, ever efficient, handed him a formal termination notice, her expression unreadable. Your things have already been packed. Security will escort you out. Selina watched as he swallowed hard, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took the document. He didn't argue. He knew better. As he turned and walked toward the back exit, the staff that had been watching the scene quickly busied themselves, avoiding eye contact. Selina exhaled slowly, shaking her head slightly. Unbelievable, she turned to Rachel. I want a full review of all senior staff. Anyone with a history of misconduct, discrimination, or poor service is gone. Immediately. Rachel nodded, already in motion. Good. Selina turned, taking in the grand space around her. This place had once tried to push her out, but now it was hers to reshape. The Celestial Grand would no longer be a symbol of exclusivity built on outdated gatekeeping. It would be a place where every guest was welcomed, where service wasn't dictated by prejudice, where the old rules no longer applied. And the best part: the people who had tried to keep her out would now have to watch as she rebuilt everything they thought they controlled. With one last glance around the lobby, Selina walked toward the private elevators, the weight of ownership settling comfortably on her shoulders. She had won. Selina stepped into the private elevator, the doors sliding shut with a quiet hush, enclosing her in a moment of solitude. She let out a slow breath, but there was no relief, only the steady hum of determination. She wasn't the type to revel in small victories, not when there was still work to be done. This wasn't just about firing Catherine Miller or Brian Lewis, or about proving a point to the people who had once dismissed her. It was about what came next, about turning the Celestial Grand into something more than it had ever been. The elevator rose smoothly, taking her toward the executive suite she had claimed as her own. Not as a guest, but as the owner. As she stepped into the expansive penthouse, the skyline stretched before her through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city pulsing with movement and life. For a brief moment she allowed herself to take it in, the sheer scale of what she had accomplished. This was what control felt like. What power truly was. Not just being let in, not just having a seat at the table, but owning the entire damn building. Rachel entered behind her, quiet but efficient as always. Press has already picked up on the acquisition, she said, scanning her tablet. Articles are hitting every major business outlet. Billionaire Selina Vaughn acquires Celestial Grand, sets plans for major overhaul. She glanced up, smirking slightly. Some of them are calling it a power move. Others are speculating why you bought it so fast. Selina smirked. Let them speculate. Rachel nodded. I've also received inquiries from industry leaders, a few private equity firms looking to see if you're flipping the property or holding it. Selina turned toward her, eyes sharp. I didn't buy this to flip it. I bought it to change it. Rachel smiled knowingly. I thought so. She tapped the tablet again. I've started assembling the new leadership team. We'll need a general manager, a new head of guest relations, and a strong director of operations. I've already compiled a short list of candidates, some from within the industry, some outside of it. People who understand luxury but also know how to run a business the right way. Selina nodded approvingly. Good. I want top talent. People who understand that service is about experience, not exclusion. This hotel is going to be a place where anyone who walks through those doors is treated like they belong. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then said, There's something else. Investors from your last hotel acquisition are reaching out. They're interested in what you're doing here. If you wanted to expand, turn this into something bigger, there's capital ready for it. Selina exhaled slowly, considering. The thought had already crossed her mind. This wasn't just about Celestial Grand. This was about the industry itself, about the way certain spaces had always operated on quiet, unspoken rules about who was welcomed and who wasn't. If she could change one hotel, why stop there? She turned back to Rachel, a slow, deliberate smile forming. Get the numbers together. If we're going to do this, we do it on our terms. Rachel nodded, already making notes. Understood. Selina took another glance out at the city below, the weight of the moment settling over her. It had started with a single night, being dismissed, being underestimated. But that was the thing about people like her. They didn't just push back. They built. They took what others tried to deny them and turned it into something unstoppable. She had walked into the Celestial Grand as someone they thought they could turn away. Now, she was walking into the future as the woman who owned it, and soon, much more. The first order of business was dismantling the old ways. The Celestial Grand had spent years catering to an exclusive elite, enforcing unwritten rules about who was welcomed and who wasn't. That era was over. Selena Vaughn hadn't just bought a hotel, she had acquired a symbol of outdated luxury, one built on quiet gatekeeping and curated exclusion. Now she was about to reshape it into something different, something better, something that thrived on excellence rather than prejudice. The transition was swift and deliberate. Within the first 72 hours, Selena's leadership team had identified and removed the dead weight, managers who had contributed to the culture of discrimination, staff members who had amassed too many complaints but had been protected by tenure, policies that had been written in ways that allowed bias to flourish unchecked. She didn't believe in second chances for people who had abused their power. The purge was necessary. And by the end of the week, the Celestial Grand was no longer operating under the same toxic hierarchy. Rachel worked like a machine, coordinating with Selena's HR and recruitment teams to fill the vacancies with fresh, capable leadership. A new general manager, Elijah Hart, was brought in, a seasoned professional with an impeccable reputation, known for turning struggling hotels into industry benchmarks. Unlike his predecessor, Elijah wasn't interested in protecting an outdated system. He valued innovation, integrity, and efficiency, which was exactly why Selena had chosen him. Under his leadership, the Celestial Grand wouldn't just be a luxury hotel. It would be the destination. Over the next month, the foundation of the new Celestial Grand began to take shape. Service training programs were completely overhauled, emphasizing genuine hospitality over performative exclusivity. Employees underwent diversity and inclusion workshops, reinforcing that respect and professionalism weren't optional, they were mandatory. Hiring practices were refined to ensure that talent and work ethic, not nepotism and bias, determined who was brought on board. For too long, positions of power had been given to those who fit a particular mold rather than those who deserved them. That changed under Selena's rule. Guest services underwent a transformation as well. The check-in process was redesigned, removing the subtle barriers that had previously been used to filter guests. No more scrutinizing certain last names or glancing at someone's appearance before deciding what level of service they deserved. Every guest who walked through those doors would be treated as if they belonged, because they did. But Selena didn't stop at operations. She rebranded the entire identity of the hotel. The Celestial Grand had always been synonymous with wealth. But under her leadership, it would become synonymous with excellence and inclusivity. She commissioned a new marketing campaign, one that showcased not just opulence, but a refined experience that welcomed all who sought it. The website was redesigned, messaging was rewritten, and partnerships were forged with diverse artists and chefs, ensuring that the hotel reflected the world it existed within, rather than a narrow, outdated vision of it. Then came the final touch, the public announcement. It was a moment Selena had been waiting for, a chance to make it known that the Celestial Grand was no longer a relic of the past but a force of the future. She stood in front of a gathered press, her presence commanding yet effortlessly poised. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned in, waiting. She let the anticipation build for a moment before speaking, her voice smooth, deliberate. When I first walked through the doors of the Celestial Grand, I wasn't seen as someone who belonged. But that was never my mistake, it was theirs. And now I'm here to make sure that mistake is never made again. This hotel has existed for decades, built on prestige and legacy. But legacy isn't enough when it doesn't serve the people who sustain it. The Celestial Grand is now under new ownership. And under my leadership, we will set a new standard, one where excellence is measured by service, not status. Where hospitality is given to everyone, not just those deemed acceptable. The era of exclusion is over. Welcome to the new Celestial Grand. The words sent shockwaves through the industry. Business leaders, travelers, influencers, and former guests all had something to say. Some praised her for modernizing the space, for breaking down the invisible barriers that had kept the hotel's clientele so homogeneous for so long. Others balked, murmuring about tradition and heritage, their coded language barely concealing their discomfort with the change. Selena didn't care. She hadn't built her empire by seeking approval. She had built it by setting the rules and forcing the world to adjust. The first few months were a test. Industry skeptics predicted she'd alienate the hotel's former clientele, that the Celestial Grand would struggle to maintain its elite status. But Selena understood something they didn't. Luxury wasn't about exclusion, it was about experience. And if you delivered the best, people would come. She elevated the guest experience in ways the previous owners never had. The fine dining program was reimagined, bringing in Michelin-starred chefs with diverse backgrounds, introducing menus that blended global influences rather than just catering to the old guard's expectations. The spa and wellness sector was expanded, offering holistic treatments that attracted an international audience. The concierge services were upgraded, with a personal touch that made every guest feel like royalty, not just the ones who looked the part. And the numbers spoke for themselves. Occupancy rates soared. Guest satisfaction ratings reached record highs. The Celestial Grand wasn't just surviving under Selena Vaughn, it was thriving. By the time the first year under her ownership closed, the industry had stopped questioning her and started emulating her. Other hotels began adopting her business model, realizing that what she had done wasn't just progressive, it was profitable. Investors who had doubted her were now trying to get a piece of the future she had created. One evening, months after her takeover, Selena stood in the penthouse suite, gazing down at the vibrant city below. The lights stretched far into the distance, the heartbeat of the world moving steadily beneath her feet. Rachel entered the room, a glass of whiskey in hand, passing it to her. "You did it," Rachel said simply. Selena took the glass, the ice clinking softly as she swirled the amber liquid. She let a slow, knowing smile curve her lips. "No," she corrected, "we're just getting started. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy."